coming war now looming closer. What began as entertainment might readily have ended in disaster, the editorial said. Radio officials had a responsibility and should think twice before mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying. 40 What the Times had inadvertently stumbled onto was the wave of the future seen through the eyes of the theoreticians at Tavistock. Henceforth, mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying that it would be taken as fact was to be standard practice for the graduates of Tavistock. All news broadcasts were to be adaptations of news and fiction in a skillful blend so as to make the one unrecognizable from the other. In fact, Tavistock put the newly tested theory into practice a year later when the population of cities in Europe, London, Munich, Paris and Amsterdam was smitten with war jitters, even as Neville Chamberlain was successfully avoiding war, using the same techniques that were employed in the October 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts. Chapter 9: How Individuals and Groups React to Blending Fact with Fiction. 41 Cantrell's conclusion was that the public reacted exactly as his profiling research experiments had led him to believe it would. That Sunday night, October 30, 1938, was to become a landmark date in his files and a date signifying a vast paradigm shift forever in the way that news would henceforth be presented. Slightly more than 7 decades later, the world is still being fed a diet of news mingled with fiction that in so many instances is terrifying. The Western world has undergone drastic changes unwillingly forced upon it, that it has become a world so vastly different from what it was on that October night in 1938, as to be another planet. We shall return to this vital subject later in this work. Following the Second World War, Cantrell became totally involved with the head guru at Tavistock, its founder, John Rawlings Rees, and his World Tensions Project at the United Nations UNESCO. Profiles on how individuals and groups reacted to international tensions were formulated on the basis of skillfully blending fact with terrifying fiction in preparation for a campaign to launch world citizens of a one-world government socialist communist dictatorship that began to be employed to weaken national boundaries, language and culture and to discredit pride of nation and sovereignty of nation-states, in preparation for the coming of the socialist New World Order, one world government. That President Woodrow Wilson said America would make safe for democracy. 42 Those fresh-faced young American boys from Arkansas and North Carolina were sent marching off to Europe believing they were fighting for their country, never knowing that the democracy Wilson sent them to make safe for the world was a socialist international communist one-world government dictatorship. John Rawlings Rees was the publisher of Tavistock's magazine Journal of Humanistic Psychology. The joint thinking mentality is seen in the 1955 monograph Toward a Humanistic Psychology, and as a progression of Cantrell's support for the Tavistock-trained Gordon Airport's perception of the personality, as he expressed it in the 1947 book Understanding Man's Social Behavior. In a chapter on causality, Cantrell's methodology was based on the conception that the particular environment in which growth takes place gives the particular individual a particular direction for growth. Cantrell's endeavors are good examples of the breakdown of boundaries between supposedly neutral opinion-taking and social engineering opinion-making. Tavistock's commitment to forcing major shifts in personality and behavior in all sectors of targeted population groups such as we have sought to describe. Cantrell appointed a board of directors to assist in the work, among who were Warren Bennis, a follower of Tavistock director Eric Trist; Marilyn Ferguson, allegedly the author of The Aquarian Conspiracy; Jean Houston, head of the Institute for Brain Research, member of the Club of Rome and author of Mind Games; 43 Aldous Huxley, who supervised the MK Ultra LSD program that ran for 20 years; Willis Harman, a Stanford University director and mentor of The Changing Images of Man, later disguised as The Aquarian Conspiracy, passed off as the work of Marilyn Ferguson; Michael Murphy, head of the Esalen Institute, established by Huxley and others as the Center for Sensitivity Training and Drug Experiments; James F.T. Bugenthal, an initiator of cult creation projects at Esalen; Abraham Maslow, the leading exponent of the irrationalist think force and founder of AHP in 1957; Carl Rogers, Maslow's co-worker at the AHP in 1957. AHP's reigning ideology was exemplified by a book review in a 1966 issue of its journal, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Reviewing Maslow's book, The Psychology of Science, Willis Harman, a year before his 1967-69 Stanford research study, welcomed the challenge to science, from extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, mysticism, and consciousness-expanding drugs, particularly LSD and mescaline. He lauded Maslow's new science, since it would bring to the fore hypnosis, creativity, parapsychology, and psychedelic experience, and shift scientific concern away from the outside world to studying inner space. This was Cantrell's original, particular personality, thinking brought to its logical conclusion. To Cantrell goes the glory and honor of forcing a vast paradigm shift on the way the Western world thinks and behaves. 44. Certainly Oswald Spengler would have had no trouble in identifying it as one of the causes of the downfall of the West he had predicted in 1936. Making changes in the cognitive and behavioral structure, whatever the particular coloration of ideology that accompanied the scientists of the polling institutions after World War II, the invariant notion of social engineering trough, sampling methods, and opinion research could be found in Cartwright's paper Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, prepared for the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture. The paper was subtitled, Selected Findings of Research on the Sale of United States War Bonds, but as Cartwright makes clear, the war-related aspect of the survey was just a pretext for conducting an analysis on the principles of how perception can be modified to suit whatever ends the controller might have in mind. One would be puzzled as to what the sale of war bonds had to do with agriculture, but that was part of Cartwright's methodology. It was the Bernays-Lippmann-Cantrell-Cartwright hypothesis synthesized and concentrated in a World War II setting. The article was featured in Tavistock's journal, Human Relations, which ought to immediately brought the reader to attention. Among the many technological advances of the past century that have produced changes in social organization, Cartwright began, the development of the mass media of communication promises to be the most far-reaching. This heightened interdependence of people means that the possibilities of mobilizing mass social action have been 45 greatly increased. It is conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will. We do not believe that Cartwright had Jesus Christ in mind when he made that statement. Under a subheading, Creating a Particular Cognitive Structure, Cartwright continues, Principle 1, it is considered a truism by virtually all psychologists that a person's behavior is guided by his perception of the world in which he lives. It follows from this formulation that one way to change a person's behavior is to modify his cognitive structure. The modification of cognitive structure in individuals by means of the mass media has several prerequisites. These may be stated in the form of principles. Interspersing his account with examples from the application of his study to the World War II war bond sale drive, Cartwright then elaborated the principles. The message, i.e., information, facts, etc., must reach the sense organs of the persons who are to be influenced. Total stimulus situations are selected or rejected on the basis of an impression of their general characteristics, etc. A second set of principles investigated more deeply the methods of altering cognitive structure. Principle 2, having reached the sense organs, message must be accepted as part of the person's cognitive structure. Cartwright noted in this section that any effort to change behavior through a modification of this cognitive structure must overcome the forces tending to maintain the present structure. 46. Only when a given cognitive structure seems to the person to be unsatisfactory for his adjustment is he likely readily to receive influences designed to change that structure. Under Creating a Particular Motivational Structure, Cartwright analyzed further the social inductions the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in Washington into turmoil for a protracted period. Chapter 10 Polling comes of age 47. The Tavistock Clinic in London was where Sigmund Freud had settled when he arrived from Germany, and where his nephew, Edward Bernays, later held court. Thus it was that England became the world centre for mass brainwashing, social engineering experimenting that spread to post-war clinics spread all over the United States. During World War II, Tavistock was the headquarters of the British Army's Psychological Warfare Bureau, which, through the arrangements of the British Special Operation Executive (SOE), later known as MI6, dictated policy to the United States Armed Forces in matters of psychological warfare. Toward the end of the war, Tavistock personnel took over the World Federation of Mental Health and the Psychological Warfare Division of the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Europe. Tavistock's chief theoretician, Dr. Kurt Lewin, came to the United States to organize the Harvard Psychological Clinic, the MIT Research Center for Groups Dynamics, the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan, while his colleagues, Cartwright and Cantrell, joined him to play a pivotal policy role at the Psychological Department of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the Office of Naval Research ONI, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and the Committee of National Morale. 48. Moreover, a large number of influential people at top policy levels were trained in Dr. Lewin's theory of topological psychology, which is to this day the world's most advanced method of behavior modification brainwashing. Important colleagues of Kurt Lewin at Tavistock, Eric Trist, John Rawlings Rees, H.V. Dix, W.R. Bion and Richard Crossman, plus selected personnel from the Strategic Bombing Survey, the Committee on National Morale and the National Defense Resources Council, joined Lewin at RAND Corporation, the Stanford Research Institute, the Wharton School, the National Training Laboratories and the National Institute of Mental Health. The United States government began contracting multi-million-dollar projects with all these institutions. Over a period of the 40 years, tens of billions of dollars have been allocated by the federal government to fund the work of these groups, while additional tens of billions of dollars found their way into these institutions from private foundations. As years passed, these institutions grew and the scope of projects they contracted grew with them. Every aspect of the mental and psychological life of the American people was profiled, recorded and stored into computer memory banks.
Did you hear that?
The institutions, personnel and networks kept on expanding and penetrating deeply into every nook and cranny of federal, state and local governments. Their in-house specialists and graduates were called in to develop policies for welfare departments, labor mediation boards, trade unions, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the National Education Association and psychiatric clinics, and the White House, the Defense Department and the State 49 Department. It also has extensive contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Close cooperative relations were developed between these think tanks and the USA's key polling organizations and the major media companies. Gallup poll, the Yankelevich, CBS New York Times poll, the National Opinion Research Center and others incessantly conducted psychological profiles of the entire population, sharing the results for evaluation and processing with the ubiquitous social psychologists. What the public sees in newspapers as opinion polls represents only a fractional portion of the work that the pollsters undertook to do. A key to the control of Tavistock over key sectors of the daily business of government in the US is that it now has its own de facto television outlet in Fox News, since its acquisition by Richard Murdoch, a virtual seamless propaganda machine for the government.
Wow, Fox News.
Above this closely knit grouping of social psychologists, pollsters and media manipulators, presides an elite of powerful patrons, the gods of Olympus, the Committee of 300. It is known in informed circles that the group controls everything in the world with the exception of Russia and latterly, China. It plans and acts out long-term strategies in a totally disciplined and unified manner. It commands over 400 of the top Fortune 500 companies in the US with interlocking connections that reach into every facet of government, trade, banking, foreign policy, intelligence agencies and the military establishment. 50. It has absorbed all the other power groups of earlier U.S. history, the Rothschild, Morgan, Rockefeller Group, the Eastern liberal establishment personified by the Perkins, Cabot, Lodge families, the creme of the old East India opium trade that generated billions of dollars. Its hierarchy comprises the old families descended from the British East India Company with its vast fortunes derived from the opium trade that is run from the top down, including European royalty among others. In the deeper recesses of the intelligence establishment in Washington, veteran intelligence officers refer to this awesome group, in hushed tones and mysterious language, as the Committee of 300. The leaders are called the Olympians. No U.S. president is elected or remains in office save and except by their favor. Those who butt their control are removed. Examples are John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. The Committee of 300 is the international socialist one-world government that runs the New World Order from behind the scenes, where it will remain until it is ready to emerge and take open and full control of all governments of the world in an international communist dictatorship. Chapter 11. The paradigm shift in education. During the 1970s, a dramatic paradigm shift in school curricula at all levels came into effect, apparently to the point that students were awarded school credits for courses in civics instead of reading, writing and arithmetic. An epidemic of casual sex and drug-taking overwhelmed school-aged teens and swept over the entire country. In July 1980, a major international conference was held in Toronto, Canada, under the auspices of First Global Conference on the Future, in which 4,000 social engineers, cybernetics experts and futurologists from all the think tanks participated. The conference was under the direction of the Tavistock Institute's billionaire chairman, Maurice Strong, who set the theme, "The time has come to move from thinking and dialogue to action." This conference will become the launching pad for that important action to occur in the 1980s. Strong was chairman of Petro-Canada, one of several flagship companies of the Olympians. His background was British intelligence MI6, where he held the rank of colonel during World War II. Strong and his network of companies were heavily involved in the highly lucrative opium heroin cocaine trade. Strong and Aldous Huxley were responsible for the FSD plague that swept the United States and later Europe. He was a former director of the United Nations Environmental Programme. One of the chief speakers for the Olympians at the conference was Dr. Aurelio Peccei, chairman of the Club of Rome, a NATO think tank. 52. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was created within the framework of the Aquarian Conspiracy, a project by the social scientists at Stanford University under the direction of Willis Harman. NATO in turn formed and promoted a new branch called the Club of Rome, the name being designed to confuse and dissemble as it had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Without going into the technicalities of the Club of Rome, hereinafter referred to as the Club, its purpose was to act as a counterweight against post-industrial agricultural and military expansion, a so-called post-industrial agricultural zero-growth society, which was meant to halt America's burgeoning manufacturing industries and growing mechanized farming food production capability. Memberships of the Club and NATO were interchangeable. Stanford Research, the Tavistock Institute and other centers of applied social psychiatry joined it. In 1994, Tavistock signed a major contract with NASA to evaluate the effects of its space program. The club itself was only founded in 1968 as part of the call for a new world order inside a one-world government. What the club became was an instrument to enforce limits of growth on industrial nations, and the United States was the first country to be targeted. This was in fact one of the earliest steps taken to implement the 300 goal of returning the US to a state of feudalism, a feudal society. One of the industries the club railed against was nuclear energy, and they were successful in halting construction of all nuclear electricity generating plants that has put demand 1,000 years ahead of the supply of electrical power. NATO was its military alliance meant to keep Russia in line. 53 on the agenda of the 1980 meeting referred to above were the following: * Women's Liberation Movement. * Black consciousness, racial mixing, breaking down taboos against mixed marriages as propounded by anthropologist Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson of Tavistock. * It was decided at this meeting that an aggressive program would be launched to portray colored races as superior to Western civilization white persons. From this forum came Oprah Winfrey and a host of black persons who were picked up and trained for their roles to portray mixed races as superior to whites. It could also be seen in movies where black movie stars suddenly proliferated until they became household names. It was seen also where a black person was placed in the role a high position of authority over whites, such a judge, or a district head of the FBI and the military, CEOs of large corporations, etc. Youth rebellion against imagined societal wrongs. Emerging interest in social responsibility of business. The generation gap implying a changing paradigm. The anti-technological bias of many young people. Experimentation with new family structures, interpersonal relationships in which homosexuality and lesbianism became normalized and, no different from other people, acceptable at all levels of society. 2 lesbian moms. The emergence of the fake conservation ecology movements such as Greenpeace. A surge in interest in Eastern religious and philosophical perspectives. A renewed interest in fundamentalist Christianity. Labor unions shifting emphasis to quality of the work environment. 54 an increasing interest in meditation and other spiritual disciplines. The Kabbalah was to supplant Christian culture, and special people were chosen to teach and spread Kabbalah. Early chosen disciples were Shirley MacLaine, Roseanne Barr and later Madonna and Demi Moore. The increasing importance of self-realization possessors. Reinvention of music, hip-hop, and rap by such groups as Ice Cube. A new language form in which English is so mutilated as to be unintelligible. This is being carried over into newsreaders on prime-time television. These disparate trends signified the emergence of a created climate of social upheaval and far-reaching changes as a new image of human beings began to take hold, bringing with them radical changes in Western civilization. A leaderless but powerful network, the Invisible Army, began working to bring about unacceptable change in the United States. Its rank-and-file members were the shock troops, who radicalized all forms of the norm, breaking with certain key elements of Western civilization. Among the Olympians, this network was known as the Aquarian Conspiracy, and its adherents were to be known as Invisible Shock Troops. This massive paradigm, gigantic, irrevocable shift, overtook America while we slept, sweeping away the old with new political, religious and philosophical systems. It was what citizens of the New World Order one world government would have to exhibit hereafter: a new mind, the rise of a new order with no nation-states, pride of place and pride of race, a culture of the past, destined to the dustbin of history, never to be revived. 55 We know from experience that this work is likely to be greeted with scorn and disbelief. Some will even pity us. Terms like off the wall will be used to describe this work. This is the standard reaction when the motivations of Tavistock's social scientists, brainwashers, opinion makers, social psychologists have for acting out their war on the United States are not known. The probability is 90% of the American people do not know that Tavistock declared war on the German civilian population to end World War II. When that conflict ended in 1946, the Tavistock practitioners of mass brainwashing and opinion went to war against the American people. If this is how you react when you read this expose, don't feel bad, then understand that it is the way you are expected to react. If the motivation appears far-fetched and lacking credibility, also incomprehensible, then the motivation does not exist. That being the case, then the action that derives from it does not exist. Therefore, ergo, the Olympians do not exist and there is no conspiracy. But the hard fact is that a gigantic conspiracy does exist. No doubt Kurt Lewin, the top scientist at Tavistock and key theoretician of all think tanks, could explain it more clearly than we have been able to do, if he chose to. His practice is derived from what he called topological psychology doctrine. Lewin is the man upon whose theories the psychological warfare battles of World War II were fought so successfully, the man who planned and executed the strategic bombing survey that brought Germany defeat in World War II through the wholesale destruction of 65% of German worker housing, to which we have just referred to very briefly. Chapter 12, Lewin's Doctrine of Identity Change. 57. The Lewin Doctrine is not easy for the layman to follow. Basically, Lewin said that all psychological phenomena occur in a domain defined as psychological phase space. This space is composed of two interdependent fields, the environment and the self. The concept of controlled environment arose from the study that if you have a fixed personality, one susceptible to being predictably profiled, and if you want to elicit from this personality a particular type of behavior, then all you have to do is control the third variable of the equation and thus produce the desired behavior. This was the norm in social psychology formulas. MI6 uses it, and almost every type of situation involving negotiations, army counterinsurgency operations, labor negotiations and diplomatic negotiations used it up until apparently the 1960s. After 1960, Tavistock changed the equation by placing greater emphasis on the technique of controlled environment, not the behavior, but the desired personality. What Lewin set out to accomplish was far more drastic and permanent, altering the deeper structures of human personalities. In short, what Lewin succeeded in doing was to move beyond behavior modification to identity change. Identity change was adopted by the nations of the world. Nations worked to acquire a new personality that would change the way the world looked at them. 58. The theory relied upon the original formulations of two Tavistock theoreticians, Dr. William Sargent's theory in his Battle for the Mind, and Kurt Lewin's own work on personality regression. Lewin observed that the inner self of the individual displays certain reactions when under tension from the environment. When there is no tension, then the normal inner self of a person is well differentiated, balanced, multifaceted, versatile. When a reasonable amount of tension is applied from the environment, then all the various abilities and faculties of the inner self go on alert, ready for effective action. But when an intolerable amount of tension is applied, then this geometry collapses into a blinded, undifferentiated soup, a primitive, a regressed personality. The person is reduced to an animal, the highly differentiated and versatile abilities disappear. The controlled environment takes over the personality. It is this Lewin technique that is used on the captives held at the Guantanamo Bay prison camp in defiance of international law and the U.S. Constitution. The gross misconduct of the Bush administration at the camp is beyond the pale of normal Western Christian civilization, and its acceptance by a docile American public might be the first sign that the American people have been so changed by Tavistock's long-range penetration and inner direction conditioning that they are now ready to descend to the level of the New World Order in a one-world government where such barbaric treatment will be regarded as normal and accepted without protest. 59. The fact that medical doctors took part in the inhuman torture of fellow human being and felt no remorse would indicate just how far down the world has already fallen. This has been observed as being the basis for the military camp at Guantanamo, Cuba, which was opened there to avoid the strictures of the U.S. Constitution and to provide a Lewin-type controlled environment. The men being held at this psychological prison are now in the state of regression where they have been reduced to the level of animals. Guantanamo is the type of camp that we predict will be established all over the United States and the world when the New World Order One World government assumes total world control. It is sadistic, inhuman and beastly, designed to break the natural pride of the victims, to break the will to resist and to reduce the prisoners to the level of beasts. During the first world government experiment in the then USSR, men were allowed to use toilets only to be interrupted in the middle of evacuating and hustled out before they could clean themselves. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo were about at that level when the controllers were roughly subjected to worldwide scrutiny. General Miller, who was the chief capo, has since disappeared from sight. Dissidents, who insist on the US government obeying the Constitution and demand their constitutional rights, will in future be treated as dissidents, exactly like Stalin treated dissidents in Russia.
Yep.
Future Guantanamos that have sprung up all over America are a portent of the future. On that we can rely. Chapter 13. The induced decline of Western civilization between two world wars. Of all European nations, in the period between the two world wars, Germany, as the super-economic, super-racial purity, super-warrior nation, suffered the most, as was the intention. The League of Nations was the first draft of the last approaching New World Order inside a one-world government, and the peace proposals at the Paris Peace Conference, directed and controlled by Tavistock, was meant to cripple Germany and make it a permanent second-class European power, the self-respect destroyed through the social demotion to pauperism or at best proletariat status. It is hardly surprising that the German people turned savage and gave Hitler the mass following he needed to convert his latent nationalistic movement into a revival force. We shall never know whether Tavistock miscalculated or indeed set the stage in this manner for a bigger and bloodier war. After all, Meade and Bertrand Russell had stated that what was needed was a world populated by docile subjects. Russell had remarked on the childlike character of the American Negro he had encountered during his travels to the United States. Russell said he preferred them to the white people. He also said that if the white race was to survive, it would have to learn to behave in the childlike manner of the Negro. Yet, in the same breath, the Tavistock emissary called black people useless eaters and declared that they ought to be wiped out en masse. 62. Russell also liked the docility of the Brazilian people, brought about, he thought, by inter-race breeding with Africans brought over as slaves. There is a school of thought that one of the primary objectives of the fiends who planned both world wars was that they would be fought for the most part by young white men. It is certainly true that Germany, Britain, the US and Russia lost millions of the flower of their male population who were removed from the nation-building stock forever. In the Tavistock engineered World War I, war fronts and battles were arranged in such a manner that Russia lost 9 million men killed or 70% of its entire military strength. With the exception of Russia, the aristocracy suffered much less than the bourgeoisie from the economic consequences of war and revolution. Traditionally, much of their wealth was in land, which did not depreciate as much during inflation as intangibles. The disintegration of the monarchies, except in England, hit the old order of society of the upper classes, who could not continue to serve society in their roles as officers or diplomats, as there no longer a much demand for the services. Opportunities for such service were far fewer than they had been before the war. Some of the Russia aristocracy courageously accepted proletarian or even menial status like the Russian taxi drivers, nightclub doormen, and headwaiters in post-war Paris. Others went into business. Most, however, fell into a life of social denigration. Where the strictly guarded frontier between societies was once impassable in the old monarchic capitals and café society, now appeared large gaps as the lines gradually became blurred. 63. As the Duke of Windsor put it in his memoirs, A King's Story, the force of change had not yet thrust so deeply into the texture of British society as to have obliterated much of the old elegance. During the so-called London season, the West End was an almost continuous ball from midnight until dawn. The evening could always be saved by recourse to one or another of the gay nightclubs, which had then become so fashionable and almost respectable. The word gay at that time meant happy. It was not co-opted as a euphemism for sodomy until the mid-50s, nor did the Duke explain that the force of change was expertly applied by the Tavistock Institute. The declining female modesty that became noticeable soon after the end of World War I suddenly appeared everywhere and with increased velocity. To the uninformed, it was a social phenomenon. Nobody could have suspected that Wellington House and its sinister social engineers were its cause. Accompanying this testamentary emancipation was a movement of revolt, particularly among young people, against every conventional restraint of mind or body coming to a close amid the shattered idols of the fallen empires. The post-war generation in Europe revolted against every more and custom, as they fought desperately to throw off the horrors of war they had lived through. Necklines plunged, public smoking and drinking became a form of revolt. Homosexuality and lesbianism became demonstrable, not from any inner conviction, but by way of protest of what had happened, and as a rebellion against what the war had destroyed. 64 Radical and revolutionary excess manifested itself in art, music and fashion. Jazz was in the air and modern art was thought to be chic. The comprehensible element in everything was don't have a care. It was unsettling and unreal. Those were the years when all of Europe was shell-shocked. Wellington House and Tavistock had done their work well. Underneath the hectic sense of being propelled forward by uncontrollable events, there was a spiritual and emotional numbness. The horror of the war in which millions of young men were needlessly slaughtered, maimed, wounded and gassed was just now beginning to register, so the thing to do was blot it from remembrances. The casualties made wars all too real in its ghastly and cruel ugliness, and people recoiled from it in shock and revolution, in the despair brought by disillusionment of peace. Europeans, with a superior culture that epitomized Western civilization, were shell-shocked to a greater degree than were Americans. They lost the faith in the rudiments that made the progress that had sustained their fathers and their grandfathers and made their nations great. And this was particularly true of Germany, Russia, France, and England. Thinking people could not come to grips with why the world's two most civilized and advanced nations had torn each other to pieces and taken the lives of millions of their finest young manhood. It was as if a terrifying madness had gripped Britain and Germany. 65 to the initiated, it was not madness, but the methodology of Wellington House that gripped the British youth. The fear that it might happen again was what almost prevented the outbreak of World War II. Officers returning from the carnage described to the news journals the horrors of hand-to-hand combat that had frequently occurred in the Great War. They were appalled and aghast, horrified and afraid. None of them could understand why there had been a war at all. The dark secrets of Wellington House and the Olympians remained hidden, even as they are hidden to this very day. Where once the laying of a wreath at the cenotaph in Whitehall, London, by the monarch of England had brought solace, it now engendered bitterness, anger and loathing. The stage was being set for the Second World War, in which Tavistock was to play a huge, disproportionate role. There were the few thinkers who did have something to say, Spengler in history for example, Hemingway, Evelyn Waugh in literature, and in America Upton Sinclair and Jack London, but their message was also gloomy, even gloomier than Spengler's dark foreboding of the inevitable decline of Western civilization. It was confirmed by the post-war degradation of personal relationships. Divorce and cheating on one's wife happened more frequently. The beautiful concept of women on a pedestal, women soft and feminine, with a lovely voice filled with cadences, the flower of God's creation, the mystery, was a vanishing ideal. In her place came the strident, the loud, the vulgar, with clattering, grating speech such as was aped and made popular by one particular popular morning talk show. 66 Nobody could possibly know that this sad decline was the end product of Tavistock having declared war on Western womanhood. In Europe after World War I, the Montparnasse in Paris had become a sad place. Post-war Vienna, emptied by the tide of war that had swept so many of her sons away, was even sadder. But Berlin, once so bustling and so clean, became the Babylon of Europe and perhaps the saddest place of them all. Whoever lived through these apocalyptic months, these years, became disgusted and embittered, sensed the coming of a counterblow, a horrible reaction, wrote the historian, Swade. The political, spiritual, and social bankruptcy of the new power elites, who succeeded the monarchs, the aristocrats and the old-fashioned bourgeois dynasties, was in many respects more spectacular than that of their predecessors, and nowhere more so than in the United States, with the coming of the socialist era under Franklin D. Roosevelt. This time, however, the eclipse of leadership was not localized in one continent or limited to any particular class of society. The geographical New World, in terms of the problems that confronted it, the America of Franklin Roosevelt soon demonstrated that the United States was scarcely less anachronistic than the Austria-Hungary of Franz Joseph had been. Here he was establishing a democratic New World Order socialism straight out of the model created by the Fabian Society, while the United States was a confederated constitutional republic, the exact opposite. 67 Neither the shift of the European locus of power and prestige from the former Central Empire Western democracies, nor the replacement of the traditional ruling classes within the fallen monarchies to the United States, did anything to the improved economic, political, social, moral or religious climate of the post-World War I world. The Wall Street crash and the depression that followed bear eloquent, if silent witness to the truth and accuracy of our statement. The manner in which this event was contrived by the Tavistock Institute can be seen in the timetable of events that which we provide in the appendix. Chapter 14 America is not a homeland. The United States of America has long been the most fertile ground for the wholesale spread of propaganda, its people having been connived, lied to, cheated, at which the British have always led the world, the premier mind-controlled brainwashing and propaganda center in the world being the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Its forerunner was the organization put together by Lord Northcliffe, who married into the Rothschild family and who was ably assisted by Lord Rothmere and the Americans Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays. From this modest beginning in 1914 grew the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which has no peer when it came to creating propaganda. Tavistock is a facility dedicated to the propagation of propaganda to suit every aspect of life. Tavistock approached propaganda as if it were going into battle, and in a sense, it was. There are no half measures, it was a war where anything goes as long as it assures victory. Surveying the political scene, one cannot escape the fact that in the past 2 decades, the increase in depth and volume of propaganda, and more especially, mind control, has become all pervasive. The correct application of propaganda to any theme, whether it is economic or political, is an essential element in the control mechanism of government. Stalin once said that if one wanted a docile population, then fear and terror had to be unleashed against them. In a sense, that is what happened in the United States and Britain. The Second World War provided unlimited opportunities of developing propaganda into a fine art. Looking back on the efforts made by the Roosevelt administration to cause the American people, who were 87% against going to war in Europe, change their minds, we find that in spite of everything, Roosevelt did not succeed. The American people rejected entry into the war in Europe. It took a contrived situation, a contrived pre-chosen pretext, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, to reverse public opinion in favor of America's entry into the European war. Roosevelt held out that America was fighting for democracy and its very way of life, neither of which bore the slightest resemblance to the truth. The war was fought to advance the cause of international socialism toward its goal of a new world order inside a one-world government. Propaganda, to be successful, must be aimed at the total population and not at individuals or individual groups, the purpose being to attract the widest possible attention. It is not intended as personal instruction. Facts play no role in propaganda, which is always to create an impression. It has to one-sided systematic, sustained indoctrination that what the government, the media and political leaders are saying is the truth. And it has to be pitched in such a manner that the people feel that it is their thinking. Thus, propaganda has to be directed at mass audiences where its message will make its mark. Let us take a recent example of the type of propaganda that would usually be embraced by a receptive audience. In the wake of the World Trade Center disaster, President Bush created a new government agency, which he called the Office of Homeland Security, and appointed a director to oversee the agency. 71 Now this sounds very comforting and very soothing until we look at the 10th Amendment, which reserves all such powers as Mr. Bush proposed to seize to the several states. The fact that Mr. Bush cannot overrule the 10th Amendment was blithely ignored. The propaganda blurb says he can, and since it was directed to the masses, they believed the blurb rather than the Constitution, and so there was little effective opposition to this gross violation of the Constitution, particularly the 10th Amendment. Bush appears to have been operating under the Stalin directive: if you want to control the people, first terrorize them. Those who opposed the Homeland Security quasi-law were dubbed unpatriotic and favoring terrorism. Again, the absolute fact that this bogus act is no law at all and is sheer propaganda was never called into question, but was accepted by the rah-rah, unthinking public. Public opinion is made in this way, and public opinion is what swayed legislators to vote for Homeland Security or any other bogus laws, as Bernays and Lippmann both asserted in the very early days of Wellington House. The legislators vote along party lines as in the British parliamentary system, and do not vote on the basis of the US Constitution. They knew that to oppose the president, they stand a good chance of losing a cozy job at the next election, or face being smeared by some sleazy muckraking administration man. America is not one homeland, but 50 distinct and separate states. In any case, the word homeland comes straight out of the Communist Manifesto. Since the ultimate goal of government is to establish a new world order, international communist one world government, the choice of this word to title communist legislation should not surprise us. 72 The power to control education, welfare and police powers belongs to the states where it has always resided, and it was not taken away from the states at the time of the Covenant. Neither President Bush nor the House and Senate have any power to change that, which the newly created office proposed to do. It was only through the exercise of sustained, systematic repetition of propaganda that the people of the states accepted this gross violation of the US Constitution. The drumbeat of propaganda continued through numerous articles about the background and experience of the Homeland Director and what his job is, etc., but there is not one word about the blatant unconstitutionality of the new department. It will not escape your notice that the very title, Homeland Security, is a clever little bit of propaganda. The people are now convinced that not only is the new agency constitutional, but that it is also necessary. The mass of people has now been successfully mind-controlled, brainwashed. Those who wish to study the matter instead of merely watching the CBS Evening News will find something quite different from an account of an independent commentator and the accounts in the press. As always, such person will be in the minority, so that his opinions, even if expressed, will not alter the purpose and intent of setting up the new agency. I say to you that the United States is forbidden by its constitution and the constitutions of the separate 50 states from having any central federal control mechanism imposed upon them. The so-called Homeland Security Bill is a travesty because it destroys the Republican form of government granted to the original states in the 10th Amendment and which cannot be taken away from them. 73. The so-called Homeland Security Act is therefore null and void and no law at all. Yet the brainwashed inner-directed victims of Tavistock will obey it as if it were law. In short, the Homeland Security Agency is a deception and it cannot be made law. No measure that is unconstitutional can be enacted into law, and the Congress has urgent duty repeal the law that gave illegitimate birth to the Homeland and Patriot Acts forthwith. The cardinal point to remember is that propaganda and mass brainwashing must always be viewed in relation to the end it is intended to serve. In this instance, it convinces the populace that liberties must be sacrificed in exchange for protection. Henry Clay, the greatest constitutional scholar who ever lived, called the ploy a doctrine of necessity, a doctrine from hell, and utterly condemned such attempts. H.V. Dix taught at Tavistock. He stated that individual rights have to be sacrificed for the good of all. That includes the measure violating the highest law of the land. It must be accepted because it is for the good of all. This is better explained if we take as an example the propaganda and brainwashing that accompanied President Roosevelt's desperate efforts to involve the United States in the war going on in Europe via Japan. When the anticipated attack on Pearl Harbor happened, Roosevelt knew the day and the time it would take place, announced in his speeches written for him by the Tavistock Institute that the American people would be fighting for the highest and noblest of causes, the defense of the nation, defense of freedom, and for the future security and well-being of the nation. As is usual in such cases, the facts spoke of a far different set of objectives. 74. Roosevelt did not say that the American people were going to war to fight for the advancement of international socialism and for the goals of the New World Order, international communism, one world government. The American people were told that Germany intended to enslave the world. This was a very good line because even the most poorly educated of people realize that slavery is one of the worst fates that mankind could be called on to suffer. By introducing the word slavery, a sympathetic chord was struck. Once again, propaganda bore no relationship to the facts. Thinking persons, not susceptible to propaganda, would have realized that a small nation like Germany could not possibly enslave the world even if it had wanted to do so. The resources and manpower were just not there. Germany did not possess the vast maritime fleet to make such an attack on the United States a real possibility. The promoters of the war realized from the very outset that for momentum to be maintained, a sustained blast of propaganda would be necessary. The same principle was followed by Vice President Cheney in the weeks preceding the US attack on Iraq. He distorted facts, delivered blast after blast of fear rhetoric, and twisted intelligence information to fit his purposes. Nobody worked harder than Cheney to ensure that war with Iraq would not be prevented at the last minute. It was important that Roosevelt attract the attention of the masses, the issues, and bring them home to the people, hence the endless press reports, the newsreels shown endlessly at cinemas, and the endless brainwashing speeches of the politicians. 75. Propaganda has to be in a medium easily understood by the lowest level of intelligence among the nation, such as posters depicting workers in munitions factories, shipyards, aircraft assembly plants, all working on the home front for the war effort, and so on. In the aftermath of the WTC tragedy, much of that type of mass brainwashing propaganda was revived. America at war, the front line, and munitions dumps, enemy troop positions, appeared as subheadings on almost everything television screened. The fact that the United States was not at war because war had not been declared, and that there were no enemy troops other than loosely knit guerrilla groups, was of course omitted. Dictionaries define troops as a body of soldiers, an army, generally in the plural. The Taliban had no army, and therefore, no troops. Besides which, war could not be declared on terrorism or Bolshevism or any other ism. War can only be declared against sovereign nations, this according to the US Constitution. War can only be declared on a country or a particular nation of people inhabiting that country. Anything else is Tavistock balderdash dished up on a platter decorated with waving flags and to the accompaniment of martial music. To say that the United States is at war with the Taliban is the height of deception. To be at war of necessity demands a prior declaration of war. Without a declaration of war it is deception, in effect no war at all. A new dimension was added. President Bush, denied war-making powers and law-making powers by the US Constitution, was suddenly imbued with powers which didn't exist in the US Constitution. 76 He began to be called the Commander-in-Chief when he was not entitled to the temporary title which can only be conferred by the Congress in the wake of a full declaration of war. That never happened. He was mystically declared as having the power to label any person he so chose an enemy combatant. That there is no such empowerment in the US Constitution, nor is it expressly implied, did not faze Mr. Bush for a moment. As far as he was concerned from then on, he was the law. Thus, the illicit, unconstitutional seizure of powers by a sitting US president that began with Woodrow Wilson taking 10 additional powers to which he was absolutely not entitled, expanded with Roosevelt taking 30 and G.W. Bush taking 35 and counting powers denied by the US Constitution. Indeed, the United States has become a lawless nation under the expert guidance of the Tavistock Institute, whose inner directional conditioning and long-range penetration brainwashing of the American public made it all possible. In passing, let me add that the British propaganda establishment used the self-same language of lies against the Boers in South Africa in the war launched by the British to take control of the massive gold deposits in that land. The British press was full of accounts of the Boer army when the Boers had no army, only a farmer-citizen guerrilla force. Like Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1913-1914, Paul Kruger, the God-fearing patriarch of the Transvaal Republic, was demonized in the British press as a vicious tyrant who brutally repressed the black population, none of which bore the slightest resemblance to the truth. 77 Eventually, a formula was arrived at through a series of trials and errors in World War I and World War II, and it was revived and adapted for use in the US attack on Afghanistan. It was enough to catch the fancy and the attention of the bulk of the American population because it was pitched to the psychological level. The lessons learned in the art of propaganda in the two world wars were simply switched from the European theater to mainstream USA, and later to Iraq, Serbia and Afghanistan. The brainwashing was kept strictly to bare essentials, embodied in simplistic slogans, catchphrases using stereotyped formulas first developed by Lord Northcliffe at Wellington House in London in 1912. The British people had to be educated that the German people were the enemy, everything evil and cruel was imputed all things German, so that the mass of British people began to believe that the Germans actually were cruel barbarians who would stop at nothing. Posters depicting the Bosch butchers killing Belgian women and children sprang up all over the place. Chapter 15 The media's role in propaganda. 79 As the media played a huge role in propaganda, it is perhaps a good idea to see where this started and how it has come to pass that the media in the US almost in its entirety is now a fully controlled propaganda organ. The period prior to the First World War was a classic series of events in which personalities were manipulated, the worst offenders being the British and American newspapers. As in all wars, someone has to be demonized to get the public involved. In 1913 it was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany who was demonized before, during and after that terrible war. One of the principal creators of propaganda of that period was Lord Northcliffe, the noted press baron, a relative of the Rothschilds and a hater of Germany. Northcliffe ran Wellington House as a major centre for anti-German propaganda, and he harboured a particular hatred of Wilhelm II, who was a cousin of Queen Victoria of the notorious Black Guelph dynasty of Venice. Northcliffe abused Wilhelm II on every possible occasion, especially on the occasions when the Kaiser talked about Germany's military might and prowess. Wilhelm was given to childish boasting, and most European governments knew him as a man who liked to play soldiers and dressing in outlandishly decorated uniforms. Wilhelm was very distinctly not a military man. As a Rothschild, this irked Northcliffe, who began warning that Germany's place in the sun, as the Kaiser liked to call it, was a danger to the rest of Europe. That this claim was without the slightest foundation did not seem to bother Northcliffe, who maximized it to the extent where it was marvelous to behold. 80 The truth is that Germany was not a threat at that time, and nor was the Kaiser a mighty warrior waiting to strike, but rather a man prone to nervous breakdowns, of which he had 3 in 5 years, and a near useless withered arm, which did not project a martial man at all. The nearest one can say that Wilhelm got to being Marshal was his love of dressing up in extravagantly bedecked uniforms. In truth, Wilhelm II had little if any control over the German military, a fact that Northcliffe was well aware of and yet chose to ignore. In this, the Kaiser was on the same level as the British monarch, King George V, who had no control of the British Expeditionary Force. That didn't stop Northcliffe of launching a blistering attack on Queen Victoria's German cousin, blaming him for being responsible for a whole list of atrocities allegedly carried out by the German army driving through Belgium. Of course, the German High Command did wrong in invading neutral Belgium, but they were only in transit with no plans to occupy the country. It was all part of a tactical plan to march on Paris, taking a shortcut through Belgium to outflank the French army. There would have been nothing to gain by deliberately killing civilians, a fact the German High Command has stressed. Northcliffe called the Kaiser a megalomaniac with a hunger to rule the world, which in any case was quite beyond the capabilities of any European power. In 1940, Churchill accused Hitler of having the same desire to rule the world, knowing it to be false. Churchill also declared Hitler a madman, knowing his characterization of the Chancellor to be false. But not to be discouraged, Northcliffe had his media outlets constantly refer to Wilhelm II as the Mad Dog of Europe. 81 Wellington House engaged the services of a cartoonist who regularly depicted Wilhelm II as a slavering mad dog, an ape-like creature. The cheap cartoons were made up into book form, and quickly granted a status by the press that was absolute nonsense. The cartoons were in poor taste and even poorer execution. The book was what the English used to call a penny horrible, showing the power of the press. Northcliffe got the media to give rave reviews about the book. Lord Asquith, the Prime Minister, was persuaded to write a foreword to what was essentially an absolute farce. President Wilson invited the artist, a Dutchman by the name of Raymakers, to the White House when he was on a book-selling tour of the US as was expected. Wilson lionized the cartoonist and gave his blessing to the book. Even the legendary Punch magazine joined in the campaign to depict Wilhelm in the most unfavorable light. It seemed that no journal escaped having to print the torrent of sewage that poured forth from Wellington House. It was propaganda in its rawest form. It was not long thereafter that the effect rubbed off on the people, who began insisting that the Kaiser be hanged, and one minister of religion went as far as to say that he would forgive Germany as long as all Germans were shot. Hollywood soon joined in the act of condemning the Kaiser, of whom it knew nothing. First off was the movie My 4 Years in Germany, adapted from a book written by US Ambassador to Berlin, James W. Gerard. The movie was depicted as a factual account of the Kaiser preparing for war. Wilhelm was given the IQ of a paranoid 6-year-old child and depicted as a man riding a hobby horse. Scathing descriptions of his disability were repeated hundreds of times. 82 worse was T.C. Come with the Hollywood version of history entitled The Beast of Berlin, that portrayed the Kaiser gloating over slaughtered Belgian civilians and chuckling in mirth over torpedoed ships. None of which was true, but it served its purpose, generating a fierce hate against Germans and all things German that spread across the US with astonishing rapidity.
Fucking Ray got me into my tunes now, so let's just see here for a second where we're at.
Was the basis of the worst type of propaganda ever seen, and it
okay, we're at a good spot. 200. Okay, I can remember that. So okay, I'm just gonna rock out here for a minute. Yeah, let's do this here. Ray just gave me a good ego boost there, so I better come with something fucking good here, right? Yeah. Let's see what I got. I don't even remember half the shit. Okay, we'll try this one. It's kind of new. Still working on it, but let's check it out. No. I hate that. You get one that's not finished. Oh well. Try to surprise myself sometimes. Yeah, let's see what else we got. Let's see what's the old one here. Let's check this one out here, guys. I'm just spitballing here, guys. Oh, nice. Nice. How's it going there, buddy? Thanks for popping in. I was playing the Tavistock book earlier. Yeah, I was playing the Tavistock book earlier, and I did that last night too. So I think tomorrow I'll probably finish it, and then I'll rock out for a little bit too. But yeah, man, it's all this. This is a really good book by a guy named Dr. John Colman, and he really does know his stuff. He was MI6, and I guess he had a conscience. So. You know, some of us do. Some of us do. You know what I'm saying? And let's see what this one is. Okay. Sometimes I'll save songs just because I want like a certain bar, or I have a certain I guess collab of two different instruments or a sound that I want to keep and I want to remember. So I just forget where I put it. Anyways. All right. So, I guess we're getting close to shut off time here. So, I think I might just, while I'm able to, because I honestly really do believe my government is an idiot, I'm going to, yeah, spend an hour or two every night dropping some chapters from some of these books, and I'm going to put my music behind it. I think that's, I mean, if you ever want to listen to an audio book, well, maybe even eventually I might even read it. But for now, I'll do it this way. But I think, who knows? Who knows? So let's see what we can do here for the. Oh, okay. Now let's try this. I don't need. Just out of curiosity. I'm an old-fashioned, an old guy. I like the horns. A lot of people don't really dig it in this new stuff, but it is what it is. So let's see. It's the thing, I make so many of these tunes, I really do forget. I gotta name them.
was carried out in a relentless fashion by the British government, not only at home, but also where it counted the most, in the United States. Wellington House was counting on the United States to defeat Germany on the field of battle. In the late 1990s, it was but a very short step for the mass of the American people to believe the same of the Taliban and of President Hussein of Iraq, with who the Taliban was not connected. In fact, they hated each other. The fundamental question, were the Taliban as a whole, and the people of Afghanistan, separate from the Taliban, responsible for the dastardly bombing of the WTC? Does the Taliban actually exist? Or is Osama bin Laden just another Kaiser Wilhelm II? Perhaps, 50 years hence we might find out the truth. In the meantime, the Tavistock Institute played the propaganda card to the limit, and once again, it succeeded.
Check my YouTube channel for more of the Tavistock Institute book by Dr. John Colman. And then more tunes by me to rock out to.
They don't get my